Well, hello everyone. It's great to have you join us today for our webinar, Small Changes, Big Impact, How Minor Tweaks in Your Class Can Lead to Improvements in Student Engagement and Outcomes in the Community College Classroom and Beyond. So we have Rachael with us today. Rachael Bateman is an accomplished and dynamic professional with 19 years of experience teaching science to a wide variety of students, including adolescents, young adults, and post-secondary students. Rachael is motivated by challenges to improve instructional practices in the classroom to include increased technology, inquiry, STEM lessons, and bridging the gap between high school and college level science classrooms to improve student performance, retention, and success. So, Rachael, we're ready to have you start your presentation.
Here we go. We're going to switch the share over to my PowerPoint. Hi, everybody. Welcome. For those of you that were signed up for this session back in November, glad you made it. I'm so sorry for the cancellation. I unfortunately have some health issues that want to rear their ugly head at the worst possible opportunity. Presentation is Small Changes, Big Impact, but it's based on a book called Small Teaching. And so I kind of altered the title for the PowerPoint. So Small Teaching, Big Impact. I've done a presentation about this content at the college where I work. So, right, there we go. So just a little bit about me. I have my bachelor's in biology. I grew up and went to school near Cleveland, Ohio. So I got my bachelor's degree in biology and my teaching certification for adolescent young adult education, life science grades 7 through 12. After I graduated from my bachelor's degree program, I interviewed at Lackey High School down in Charles County, Maryland in 2006. I got a job offer and I packed up all my stuff and moved to Maryland. While I was still teaching at Lackey, I went back. I got my master's degree in chemical and life sciences through the University of Maryland College Park. I stayed at Lackey for 14 years between 2006 and 2020. I also had some experience during that time teaching as an adjunct. I started at the College of Southern Maryland, where I'm now employed full-time back in 2011 as adjunct faculty teaching zoology on Saturdays. Eventually, my courses weren't running because of low enrollment, and being an adjunct, I was always the first one to get cut. So I applied for an adjunct position at UMGC. I'm still with the University of Maryland Global Campus. I teach 5 to 6 classes a year, all online and all in the field of biology. At CSM, I am now an associate professor. I got tenure last summer, so very exciting, and I am in the process of my final promotion to professor. I teach in the School of STEM and Professional Studies, and in addition to my teaching load, I also coordinate courses. So I do our environmental science courses, our physical geology, and general science courses. I also am the contact at CSM. I'm the program coordinator for our environmental studies associate's degree program. So a lot of history, teaching science. And one of the things that I have tried to focus on since I moved up to college level full-time is trying to make better connections between my college students and their high school education. Being a former high school educator, I know that some of the things that I told my students about what to expect at college have changed a little bit. Especially in the sciences, we're finding from research that the straight up lecture, the professor talks to you for an hour and a half, 2 times a week for a full semester is not the best way to learn. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is find ways to change that traditional lecture, get a little bit more interactive, and doing that to help my students with their learning and their retention. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today is some small things that you can do, small things that I do um, to increase my students' engagement, in the long run, increase student success. So I want you to open your chats for a second. There are going to be lots of opportunities for you to participate in the chat today. Other than asking questions, I'm going to ask if you can share some ideas for the good of. And so I want you to, in the chat, think about if you had a magic wand and you could change just one student behavior, whether it's reading the syllabus, asking questions, participating in class, turning in their work on time, what would it be? What is that one thing that if you had that magic wand, you would wish for across all of your courses? So I'm interested to see what you guys think. Oh, doing assignments more than 2 hours before they are due. Amazing. Or even starting them the day before they're due, especially I'm teaching a web class right now. I don't really teach so much online, but because of the health stuff. And I can't tell you how many students are waiting until the day that labs are due. They've had a whole week to actually start their labs. So I absolutely agree, Colleen, that would be amazing if I could get my students to start their work a bit sooner. Attending class regularly, absolutely. And I'm in this weird position because for 14 years of my career, student success was my responsibility. And now things are a little different as a college professor. But I still want to do whatever I can to ensure the success of my students, just doing it in a little bit of a different way, where, students that aren't completing their assignment class regularly contact their parents. We can't do that. FERPA tells us we can't do that. And so trying to find other ways to get students engaged may help some of, those kind of barrier issues. So as educators, a magic potion, a magic wand for teaching and engaging students and helping students learn would be amazing. If there was some kind of resource where it would give you syllabus advice and in-class exercises and conversation starters, that would be great. Just a step-by-step, this is what you do. And so that's really what we're going to try to focus on today. Not making huge changes, not overhauling everything that we're doing, but trying to find small things that we can do that will have big effects on our student behavior and student learning. So although I tend to teach mostly freshmen or sophomores, I teach a lot of our dual enrollment students who are high school students also taking college classes. I also teach early college at CSM. So these are students that are bused to our campus 4 days a week for at least one academic year, if not 2. And so these are the students that I really wanted to start focusing on in the beginning and then trying to roll that out across the board for just your gen ed college students, your 18 to 21, 22-year-olds. Although at a community college, that's not always my typical college student. So the inspiration behind this presentation, behind these changes, these recommendations, comes from James Lang's book, Small Teaching, specifically the second edition. I liked the first edition, but the second edition had a lot more practical things that I could actually do, that I could see myself doing. And the nice thing about James Lang and the things that he writes about, whether it's small teaching, he also had a couple books about online teaching that I picked up during COVID that I found extremely helpful. The things that he recommends are based on cognitive theory. It's based on research, based on data. And as a scientist, that appeals to me very much when we can link things back to data. I see the strength in that argument. And so he makes a lot of suggestions of what he calls powerful changes, small, powerful changes that you can put into practice at your next class. Just pick one. At the end, I'm going to ask you what that might be. So as we're going through the presentation, I I hope that you're thinking about how you can apply this within your own classrooms. And so we know what the research says. We know what the classroom environment is somewhat like in college. And, if we can find ways to engage our students that don't cause a lot of work for us, then that's great. It's kind of a win-win situation. So that's the goal, is to make some of these small changes. So I want to ask you a couple questions. So there's 2 questions on the screen. If you would open up your chat and do true or false. So our first question 1, true or false, reading the textbook is the most effective way for students to study. And then question 2, also true or false, mixing up different types of problems makes learning harder, but retention longer. These are meant to be questions that apply across disciplines, not specifically to science. So is reading the textbook really the best way to study? True or false? And then if you're doing, whether it's a science class or a math class or even a philosophy class, presenting different types of problems, different approaches, different types of presentation styles can make learning harder, but makes retention longer. And so there's quite a few people putting into the chat, which is excellent. I'm seeing a lot of F's for number 1, which is wonderful. So question 1, rereading the textbook is the most effective way for students to study. That is false. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place or that it's not effective. But generally, rereading the textbook is still a way of retrieving the information. And reading a book is not always the best way to retrieve the information that's already in your brain. Practice, be in preparation for an exam or something similar. And then question 2, mixing up different types of problems, different types of media, different types of lecture can absolutely make learning harder, especially when students don't see those connections. But when they do see the connections, it actually makes their retention longer and better. And that has a lot to do with, I call it interleaving. It's a phrase that James Lang uses, and it has to do with how we kind of combine facts and information in our brain so that it's easy to access it later. All right, so this is a quote from James Lang's book. The whole goal behind this idea of small teaching is to spark positive change in higher education through small but powerful modifications in our course design and our teaching practices. So I've summarized a lot of the information from James Lang's book in this PowerPoint. But before we actually get into his data, cognitive theory, all those things, let's look at Bloom's. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I kind of took a detour on the way to teaching college and taught high school. And so part of my bachelor's program was learning all about Bloom's taxonomy, all about teaching, how to teach. And so we just want to keep in mind that remembering, being able to remember specific facts is the base. That's where we start. But our goal is to get our students to the pinnacle of the pyramid, into the creating stages, where they can take the information they've learned from our courses and use that to create something new, to, really interact with the information. And so the things that we do in our classes can help our students to move up in the pyramid, in Bloom's taxonomy. We need to get away from the typical lecture where we just expect students to memorize things. That's how I learned in college, and I still kind of fall back into that. But I can also acknowledge that it's not the best way to learn for everyone. So there are 3 major sections in the book Small Teaching. The first section is all about remembering. So that's that base of Bloom's taxonomy. We want to be able to use what's in our brains. When we are observing the world, we tend to see new facts. Sometimes it's as we're searching on the internet, scrolling social media, reading articles. But when we do that in these isolated kind of areas, it leads to rather shallow thinking. When we can take facts and relate them to other facts, and we can see the relationships between that information, then we can think critically. We can analyze the information, and we can be a little creative in how we're thinking about that concept. So, in order for us to develop our critical thinking skills, we have to know things. We have to be able to remember the facts. It's still the base of the pyramid. And so, predicting is one way to do this. James Lang calls it predicting. You're probably familiar with the idea of activating your prior knowledge. And so one way to kind of do this would be to open up your class with a brainstorming activity, where you're asking students to deep dig into their prior knowledge. Maybe it's individually, maybe it's in small groups. Maybe you start as an individual, then it's a pair, and then it's the whole class discussing. And there are ways to organize the way that you're teaching and to organize that knowledge to help students be prepared for what's to come. So I have some examples. I used to do this in high school too. I always started class with a meme of the day. A lot of students today resonate with memes. I'm a millennial. I also resonate with memes. They're kind of one of the things that I really enjoy. And I really like taking science memes and trying to apply them to things that we're talking about in class. So I have an example on the left-hand side. Since people only kill spiders, that they see, humans are acting as agents of natural selection, causing spiders to be selected for reclusion and intelligence. We are actually making spiders smarter over time. And so this is just one way. It could be a meme of the day, it could be just a photograph, it could be a quote. And trying to get students to connect that to maybe the previous class or to predict what they think might be happening in today's class. Okay, so this is another opportunity, if you feel like you want to share any ideas that you think might be helpful for others in the webinar. Are there things that you already do in your classes that work kind of like what I'm suggesting? The idea of it's kind of a hook, getting students engaged into the content, what you're doing that day, or any ideas of things that you might be able to do in the future. So if you think of any examples of predicting that you want to drop into the chat, please feel free. And I'm going to keep on going. So predicting is the first stage of this section. The next is retrieving, where we're actually going to pull that information out of our brain. Also sometimes referred to as the testing effect. And so usually as educators, we use questions in order to help our students to retrieve information, retrieve facts. It might be out loud, orally in class. We might give them questions to answer as homework. But this is for information that we've already covered. I use a lot of discussion posts in my classes, whether they're web-based or in person, to try to draw out the information that we've already discussed in class. And I think a lot of us do that, but that's a big change to your class. So there are smaller ways to do this. In K-12 education, a good example of this are what are called KWL charts. And I actually utilize these in my environmental science lectures. So I have my students fill out K and the W. K is for what you know. The W is for what you want to know. So I ask the students to make a list things that they know related to a specific topic that we're going to talk about that day. So maybe it's population growth in the human population. And I just want them to jot things down. You can do it very loose, or you can give them specific information to focus on. But the K and the W should come before the lecture. So I have my students do this at the start of class while I'm, taking attendance and kind of getting myself ready. I introduce the topic and I ask my students to jot things down. At the end of class, then that's when they'll go in and fill out the L. Or if I talk too much, which happens, sometimes I ask them to do that L portion independently. Sometimes it's helpful to wait a little bit before filling out the L, or going back to this chart after it's been 24, 48 hours, and get back in there and see if there's anything that they missed. So, for example, teaching science, I might ask a question like, we've seen several experiments in this area already this semester. Can anyone remind me of what we've already seen? Rather than me telling them what they've seen, asking them to tell me, kind of flipping the script a little bit. So with retrieving, there's lots of different ways that we can do this. And KWL charts are just an example. So if at any point, as we're going through these slides, any slide where I have an example from college STEM, I'm going to open up the opportunity for you to participate in the chat if you'd like to. So we're going to move on to the third part called interleaving. Interleaving is spacing out, mixing up learning, trying to appeal to different learning styles. Rather than, simple memorization questions on quizzes or exams, you can use different types of questioning to help students connect the new material to older material, or to revise their understanding of a concept based on something that they recently learned. A big part of these ideas of small teaching and of small changes is to help our students to really internalize the information that we're trying to teach them. So in a lot of high schools, especially any schools that are AVID schools, AVID is something that I know we have in Charles County. I'm not 100% sure about all of the other counties, but AVID is a program for students. They have to apply. And through this program, they learn strategies to help them to become more successful in high school, but also with the end game of helping them to succeed in college in the long run. And one of the ways that you can do this is by using Cornell notes. A lot of students struggle with Cornell notes. If we don't present it in a way that makes sense to them, it can be a little challenging. But it's still something that I recommend to students if it's helpful for them. I think a big part of helping our students to think critically is to also help them figure out, is my learning style? What are the things that work best for me? Cornell notes are formatted specifically. The students have a notes column, which is typical to, how I took notes in college. But it's set up with a Q column immediately to the left. So Q column is something where students can put main ideas. They can jot down questions that they have throughout the lecture, and those questions, they can look back at those, try to answer them. Any diagrams, any study prompts, like if you as the instructor are saying, this piece of information is very important, it's going to be on the exam, that's kind of where students would note that. And then the final piece is something that it's very similar to like the KWL charts, the summary. The summary is usually at the bottom or at the end of the notes. And it's really helpful for students to do this after the lecture is finished, to go back in and try to summarize the main goals of that particular. You could also have your students create test questions. Spend the first 5 minutes of class, ask your students to write a couple of test questions about a specific topic. And then maybe they pass those to another student. They swap and they try to answer those questions. Or you collect them as the instructor and you use those to help them to study, create a whole study guide. Could even use some of the questions on your actual assessment. Another way to kind of help students with interleaving is connecting different lectures. And so you can ask your students to go back to the previous lecture and underline what they think were the 3 most important pieces from that lecture, or jot those down on a sheet of paper. You could even get some Post-it notes. Give every student a Post-it note as they walk into the class. Have them fill out on that Post-it note is what you think is the most important principle from our last class meeting. They write it down, have them posted on the board. You could collect them. There's lots of different ways to try to get your students interacting with information on multiple opportunities to help them with their retention. So the next big section of small teaching is where we start to help our students to build understanding. So in the first section, it's all about connecting prior knowledge with new knowledge, but when we really start to work to understand, deepen their understanding, that's going to help them to improve their own learning. And hopefully in time, they become mindful practitioners of a range of cognitive skills. Most of our students who come to us in college do not have well-developed critical thinking skills. And we can help them with that by making some of these small adjustments. Sometimes we have to point out the connection. Sometimes we have to help our students understand how to connect. So a lot of students, when they learn a piece of information, it kind of goes into these separate components, these separate areas in their brain. But if we really want to help our students with comprehension, that's where we have to connect these facts, these pieces of information for our students. And so this one's a little different. So I mentioned before, I sometimes would start class with a meme of the day. With this one, I would ask my students to find a meme. I actually do this in my introductory posts for online discussion boards. I ask the typical questions, what's your major? What are you interested in? But then I also ask my students to find or create a meme that demonstrates how they feel about this class. And I think it's a really great way to connect what a student is feeling with something else, something visual. So that's just one example. You could even ask your students to, find a podcast related to a topic that you've talked about in class. You have a discussion post where that's what students are sharing. The more that we can get our students looking for our content in their daily lives, better it can be for them to help connect our classes with the rest of the world, rather than keeping them kind of separated. So being able to connect information is really helpful, but so is practicing. So look at your course schedule. A lot of times we have certain material that we have to get through, but it can also be helpful to build in small practice sessions for our students. Whether it's, doing specific types of problems in a math class, or, collecting data, analyzing in a science lab, but trying to fit areas of practice into your course can be very helpful for our students. So anytime that I have a big assessment, I do this a lot in a non-majors course called scientific reasoning. Students get a study guide, but the day before they take assessment, I'll have the students get into small groups. And in some cases, I have them try to answer the questions at the end of the chapter to help them to prepare. Sometimes I'll put them into teams and do something similar to like Jeopardy, something that I used to do quite a bit as a high school educator, that can help our students to practice. And if you utilize the same type of question format in your game or whatever practice activity that you're doing, it can also help your students to get prepared for how those questions are going to be asked. That's why I use the questions from the book, because a lot of the multiple choice questions on the assessment came from the publisher or were edited from what the publisher provided. So, trying to help students practice be really beneficial, or even having practice quizzes. If you have like a book companion site, when I teach zoology, I use Mastering Biology. And so in that course in zoology, I include practice quizzes in every module to help students prepare to take the exams, which are also given on that companion site. So they're not required, they're optional. I give 1 point of extra credit towards the assessment, and the students that that are interested in having that opportunity will use it. And it doesn't hurt the students. That gives them that option. Another way for us to help our students with, internalizing this information has a lot to do with explaining the learning process, whether it's speaking about it, writing about it. It's an important part of the process of critical thinking and learning. So in some cases, peer instruction might be beneficial. Students are given a topic, and they get a chance to present that to the class. When the students provide an answer, they should take the time to explain, how they got. I'll talk about an example, a think, pair, share. These are things that I used in high school all the time. I found them to actually be extremely beneficial because it doesn't take a lot of work. I give the students a topic. I say, okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about this on your own and jot some things down on your paper. Then 2 to 3 minutes to get with what I call elbow partners, the people sitting next to you, in front of you, behind you, and share. And then come back as a whole class to talk about what, each little group found that activity. And so that is a way to kind of take the pressure off a little bit, for the students who don't want to actually share their answers with the whole class. They only have to share them with one person, and they get the chance to edit what they're going to share with the whole class. So it's right there. Think, pair, shares. I use these a lot in environmental science, especially with topics and concepts that are difficult to understand, and also with concepts where there's conflict between belief and science, because that is a lot. It's, like I said, it's just really easy to implement on a slide, a question or a topic that I want the students to discuss. And then can take anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how in-depth you actually want the students to go. So the last piece of what James Lang presents, in his book is about inspiration. And I know that, after we've been teaching for a while, sometimes we even lose our own inspiration. So there is a part of this section that's not just about our students, but it's also about us as our students, ourselves. We're not just neural networks. Your students are not just receptacles for information that you need to fill up. And we're not just practitioners of cognitive skills. The more comfortable we feel, the more connected we feel, the easier it is for us as humans to learn from our experiences. But if we're isolated or feel threatened, that's taking away some of our brain power. Our brain is focusing sometimes on that threatened feeling that can prevent us from learning as deeply as we might like. If you're sitting in a classroom feeling uncomfortable, hoping and praying that your instructor does not call on you to answer questions, you're not focused on what's happening. And so there are ways for us to try to help inspire our students. The first that is identified in this section is belonging, instilling a sense of cognitive belonging for your students. Sometimes we might do this through like a discussion board. Sometimes it's more private, or only we are looking at this information. But I think it can be really helpful to get to know your students a little bit. It may not develop into the types of relationships that, a high school teacher builds with a student over 180 days. I can tell you for a fact, the relationships at the college level are different. But getting to know who's in your classroom, what they bring to the table, whether it's academic or personal, their cultural backgrounds, their experiences. Our students are all unique. The way they interact with our material will be unique. So getting to know our audience can help to make our students feel like they belong, or to inspire them, to get them interested. So at CSM, one of the things that we use in all what are called gateway courses are 1,000 level courses, mostly taken by freshmen, a lot of them during their very first semester at the college. And one of the assignments that the students complete at the beginning of the course is called the My Plan for Academic Success. It takes students anywhere from 15 to like 30 minutes at most, usually, to answer some questions. Questions like, why are you taking this class? And I tell students, if you're taking this class because it's a requirement for your major, I want you to tell me that. I want you to be honest about why you're here. Your goals. Do you want an A? Are we aiming for an A, or are we just aiming to get through because it's a requirement for our major? There are questions about, when does our class meet? Do you have to come to campus? Or can you attend from home? How many credits is this class? How long does it run? And then also information in there that explains to students about how many hours of homework they should anticipate based on number of credits and the length of the course. They get a chance to identify their pronouns, identify any nicknames that they might. There are questions about students' technology. If you're teaching a Zoom class, it's helpful to know if your students have a webcam and a microphone and a computer. It doesn't mean that I have to fix it as the instructor. For me, it's more about collecting the information so that I know what I'm dealing with, so that I can make these small changes that are going to be best for the people that are in my classroom. We also use early alerts at CSM. So if a student doesn't show up on the first day of class, we submit a non-attendance flag. It goes to our folks in learning support services. And then those individuals will try to reach out to the student through email, through phone. These early alerts are really helpful. But it's important when we use something like a flag, identifying that there's an issue, We also want to use something for when there isn't an issue. You know, like stickers when you were in elementary and middle school. I still gave stickers to high school students when I was teaching at Lackey because even high schoolers still like stickers. I don't really do that so much at college, but we do have what we call kudos. And all of our instructors have the ability to raise a kudos flag, identifying when a student is doing well. I might enter them after an assessment and give kudos to all the students who got A's and B's and C's. And then I might, I don't know, do kudos after the next assessment. Or if in my environmental science class, I have a series of research papers students work on over the course of the semester. So I might submit a kudos for a student whose module 1 paper was a C, but they managed to get an A on module 2. Acknowledging when our students are doing the things that are helping their learning can help to make them feel more positive about the learning experience, about the process. And so those are just 2 examples of trying to create that belonging. I have coworkers that will work with their students on the first day of class to determine what the expectations are for behavior. So rather than they, as the instructor, saying, this is how I expect you to behave, the students get to take part in the process of determining what rules are appropriate. And then they feel invested in many cases. Sometimes our students need motivation, and sometimes it needs to be intrinsic motivation. They need to be motivated for themselves. There's only so much that we can do as educators, whether we're college educators or elementary school educators. Our students are individuals. They have different backgrounds, interests, motivations, and I'm not going to be able to turn every student into a lover of science. That's just the reality. You know, some students dislike science. My goal for those students is to try to make it more accessible to them. But I'm not expecting them to major in science. But if we can help our students with the learning environment in our classes, we can boost their positive emotions, and that can help to boost their learning. Feel good about something, we're going to put in more effort towards it. So when you have a class, whether it's a Zoom class or an in-person class, when students come in, if you're in class 10 minutes early, you're setting up your PowerPoint, you know, you're just kind of getting ready for rather than the students just coming in and sitting down, engage. Maybe there's a specific question that you ask all of the students when they come in. But when you do that, when you start to engage with your students, you start to get to know them. That can help us as educators, but it's also really helpful for our students because it can help them to feel seen. If you have an athlete that plays on your school's basketball team or football team or soccer, sometimes even just asking, you know, how was the game? It can make the world of difference to our students. Although they are young adults in most cases, that sense of belonging and that intrinsic motivation is still very important, even at the college level. The last piece, what Lang talks about in his book, is learning, but this is learning for us, learning for the instructor. Read a book. Read 1 book every year or 2 books every year about teaching and learning. If you're not really a book person, there are plenty of other opportunities available for us as educators to advance our understanding. So I've started listening to a lot more podcasts in the last couple of years because my commute to campus is about 45 to 50 minutes. And I wanted to use that time more effectively. Other than just listening to music and driving, I've started listening to different podcasts. So the ones that I have listed on the screen are ones that I have found helpful. Teaching in Higher Ed is great. Teach for Teaching is another good one. And then leading lines is the third one that I listen to on a pretty regular basis. Looking at articles in journals and stuff that's focused on the science of learning. Those are the kinds of things that I look out for. And I think it can be really, really helpful when we find these resources that are good for us, share them with our colleagues. I am constantly forwarding emails for webinars and workshops and things that are available to my coworkers, just to try to get us all engaged and moving forward. We also all have an annual faculty development plan. We have to have a certain number of hours towards professional development and service. And so this is an opportunity for us to work with our colleagues to try to improve, what we're doing in our classes. The science of education is constantly changing. It's just a science. The data is showing that traditional lecture is not as effective. And I know specifically in the science classroom, traditional lecture leaves a lot of gaps in knowledge and understanding. And so just kind of taking a step back as an educator and trying to identify little things that I could do to improve things for my students is always be helpful for me in the long run. So I'd like you to take a second and I want you to think about all the different things that we talked about, whether it's using memes, giving students an opportunity to practice in class, the KWL charts, Cornell notes. Is there anything that you are committed, pledging, that you're willing to try in your next class? But don't hit enter. You could type it in. Think about, the beginning of class, the first 5 minutes, the last 5 minutes, the time where it's not in the middle of your instruction. Some of the easiest ways to incorporate. Even making your PowerPoints more interactive. Some universities and colleges have access to tools like Mentimeter. Mentimeter is an opportunity to get your students drawing things in class and posting words. You can create like word clouds and stuff. Okay, so if you have something typed into the chat, something that you're willing to try, go ahead and hit enter. Let's see. But all right, KWL, I like it. Good stuff. All right. Do you have any other suggestions, things that you want to share for the good of the group? Please. If you have any questions after the fact and you want to email me, or if you would like a copy of today's PowerPoint, definitely give that to the folks at MOL. But I'm also happy to send this to you in an email, bateman@csmd.edu. And that is the end of my presentation. So I'll put this as well, just in case. Go. Okay. So I'm going to end my presentation. I'm going to switch back to the closing screen. And if any of you have any questions that you want to ask before we call it a day, you can feel free to drop questions in the chat. We have about 10 minutes left before the end of the scheduled session. And then I don't remember who had power. Julia, Ron, or Wendy, can one of you share that last slide? Thanks.
Yeah,
All
there you
right, so
go.
this is
Yeah,
just
thank
the,
you, Rachel. Yeah, the last slide that you can take a picture of for your proof that you attended, that you can put in your professional development portfolio. So yeah, thank you, Rachel, for a great presentation today about how we can uh, use some of those small teaching things to impact our teaching. The KWL chart, I love that. That is a great one that I love to do with my students too. So I'm not seeing any questions at the moment.
folks. Well, if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat, but that's the end of the information that we have to share today. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.